Welcome back to The Heat. African states are pushing for institutional reforms in the United Nations Security Council in an effort to ensure the continent is not sidelined in the decision-making process. Leaders would ultimately like a permanent seat on the council. Joining us now from Johannesburg is William Gumede. He's an associate professor with the School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Also with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Ambassador Robin Sanders. She has served as the U.S. ambassador to Nigeria and the Republic of Congo. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Ambassador, let me first talk about Boko Haram. As we just heard Ambassador Nzomo from Kenya say, there is going to be a force of some 7,500 people to combat Boko Haram. She says that's not going to be enough, and the solution is not military. We have to address socio-economic problems as well. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there are a number of things. First of all, I think it's very, very significant that the African Union has decided to start a force, a standby force, or use a standby force in northeastern Nigeria. I think that's very important. It's going to take a long time to stand up in 7,500. And you really need to focus on countries whose troops have served in asymmetrical warfare. Not all countries are going to be able to have an impact in that region if they don't have experience in dealing with asymmetrical warfare like Boko Haram, like terrorist groups. So, I would look at Kenyan troops, Mali, Chadian troops, those who've served in CAR, because it's very, very different for a regular standing army to transition to asymmetrical warfare. So that's one. And I think it is important. Yes, the social economic issues that were mentioned by the professor in the clip are very important, but alone you need both things together. You do need the military backup, and you do need to address social economic issues on the ground. Both of those things are important, and I don't think you can deal with the situation with Boko Haram without doing both. In the interim, though, as we know that it takes so long to stand up 7,500 people, they need to have a better strategy of trying to at least hold Boko Haram where it is now, as opposed to it expanding, particularly as Nigeria faces its election on February 14th. We just had another female bomber blow herself up on Saturday, right after the presidential rally had just finished. So I think that Boko Haram sees the vacuum right now as an opportunity, and they're going to continue to step up actions until the elections.
Right. William Gumede in Johannesburg, is the threat posed by Boko Haram getting enough attention, especially in what we refer to as Western countries? There's a chance now that the threat that Boko Haram poses could spread to other countries as well. Is it getting that attention in Western capitals?
It hasn't gotten that attention that it should, be getting. But the problem really is, is that, Africans haven't really put a political will, behind this crisis of Boko Haram. We haven't seen a collective strategy until now. And maybe that is where we have to look at, real politics has just been the last couple of years and so on the African continent. We're not going to get the kind of, Western attention to African problems. And that is where the African Union will have to step in, and they should have, stepped in earlier and, and get a collective effort together. But, just, to continue what the ambassador, have been saying, what we need here now in Nigeria is a dual strategy. Is first to deal with the socioeconomic issues and deal with the governance issues, because really, the lack of democracy and poor governance really open up African countries, for fundamentalisms and so on. But secondly, what we need to get we need to really get a collective African effort. And even, this new force, collective African forces put together, I think, it's just not enough. We needed, many, many more African troops, in Nigeria now to deal with the issue.
I would actually say that the troop strength is at least a start. I agree that the African Union should have come in way before now. But the other thing is the neighbors themselves, those in the neighborhood, are not working collectively together. They're not sharing intelligence well. They're just now having fits and starts with whether or not they're going to work together. They started, 3 months ago, then nothing happened. Now the Chadians have come in to help Cameroon. The Chadians have come in and they've bombed parts of Cameroon to force Boko Haram out. So there's a lot of missing parts to this. Certainly an overall strategy needs to be put in place that has all elements, the AU elements, something from the neighbors, and something from Nigeria's friends. And that needs to be sustained, consistent, and really there for the long term.
Right. Boko Haram, of course, is just one of the problems facing Africa right now. It's faced enormous challenges, the continent, over the past few years. The Ebola crisis, we have continuing violence in the Central African Republic, in Eastern Congo,
Mali.
South Sudan. Is the AU addressing this?
I think the AU has a Peace and Security Committee, and there are a number of significant countries that are part of that committee. I think that what needs to be done, though, is the statements and the verbiage needs to be turned into more practical actions on the ground. And I think that that's a capacity issue that the African Union has to figure out how to do. There are a number of crises. Mali, I would add to the list that you put together. Mali is still very tenuous, very fragile in terms of the northern area and security. So I think that what needs to be done is a comprehensive strategy that has all of these elements in it in a significant way, so that you're not looking at things piecemeal. You certainly have the issue of al-Shabaab in eastern Kenya.
Right.
And so I think those countries that are faced with conflict really need to be all part of the Peace and Security Committee of the AU, so they can bring to the table their various strategies to try to put that together in some sort of comprehensive way to respond.
All right, William, you talked about good governance just now, and that is an issue that needs to be addressed by African leaders. The new chairman of the AU is Robert Mugabe. He's the Zimbabwean president. He recently addressed the sanctions imposed on his country. Let's take a listen to what he said.
As for the West, well, it's up to them to do what they choose to do. After all, for more than 10 years, I've been under sanctions. My country has been under sanctions. If they want them to continue, well, it's up to them. But we say that sanctions are wrong.
So, William, here we have Robert Mugabe, a man who's been accused of human rights violations in his country by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch. I mean, what kind of a message does the AU send to the world when it selects Robert Mugabe as its chairman?
I mean, that's the irony, because, I mean, the real problem, for African, where it's economic chaos and economic stagnation and fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, really is at the heart of it is a governance issue. Now, if you're going to elect Robert Mugabe as the AU chairperson, the message being sent out there is that African leaders are not serious, about getting to the heart of Africa's problems, which is governance. I mean, for me, governance is at the heart of those kind of problems. But for me, the other irony really has been that, what Boko Haram and what is it doing in Nigeria, and the poor response so far from African countries says also a lot about the lack of integration. I mean, we've been talking the last couple of years about, integrating African economies, integrating, African politics and so on. I mean, that's just has been at the top of the agenda of the AU. But what we're seeing is, Nigeria's neighbors have not cooperated with Nigeria. I mean, it's extraordinary that, Nigeria had to go to France in order to get its neighbors to cooperate to deal, with Boko Haram. What does it say about the African Union and the African Union's capacity, to mobilize all of the African countries behind one single goal? I mean, it does really say something, about, the political credibility of the African Union among its own members, that has been unable really to mobilize, Nigeria's neighbors to help it.
Just the point that you make, Ambassador, that there's a lack of cooperation, and as William says, lack of integration as well. But he also did say that, the election of someone like Robert Mugabe to chairman of the AU indicates that African leaders are not really serious about tackling the problems that bedevil the continent.
Well, I think it can be looked at two ways. I certainly don't disagree with that premise, but I also know there's a sense on the continent of, you know, stop telling us what to do because what you've told us thus far has not been successful. And I almost, you know, looked at the election of Robert Mugabe kind of in that context. Certainly it doesn't diminish, you know, the challenges and the criticism and what he's done over the years, but there is also this irony. Same thing if you look at the ICC, you know, you have this push-pull tension a little bit, saying that, you know, there's a double standard. And I think in a way that you could look at the election of Mugabe in that regard. It's not useful necessarily, but I do think that there's a sense that the African Union, and I want to just give the African Union some credit too here because, you know, they have stepped up with African Union-backed forces in South Sudan. They have contributed to the situation in CAR as well. So, I mean, they have had a capacity problem. They still have a capacity problem, and certainly contributing troops is definitely one of them. He talked about integration. Regional integration on the continent is really, really dismal. Percentage-wise, you're looking about maybe, you know, just about 25% of the entire sub-Saharan African continent has some sort of integration. That means whether it's infrastructure, whether it's power grids, all of those kinds of things. And that's a real problem for a continent that will have 2.4 billion people by 2030, of which more than half of that will be people under the age of 25, and the other half will also be women. So when you're looking at those kind of development issues, then you really have a very difficult environment where the African Union has to increase its capacity to be able to deal with those issues.
William, one other development, and there's a strong push now by the African Union, by Africa as a continent, to seek a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. They want to speak with one voice. I mean, how realistic is this, and what would it really achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe just before we get there, I just wanted to say, you know, the other weakness really that's been preventing Africa, you know, to get a collective response, you know, to deal with the threats of terrorism and, you know, and so on, has been, you know, that African countries and also African continental organizations have been focusing on protecting the sovereignty of states and not of people and individuals. So, you know, so there has to be a sea change in the thinking, you know, at the African Union level also, because in the past, the African Union really has been focusing on protecting really the integrity of, you know, of African governments and countries, not the integrity of African individuals. So now with the Boko Haram attacking, you know, individuals, ordinary citizens and so on, it's been very difficult for the African Union to respond to that. But it's also been very difficult for individual African countries to respond to attacks on their citizens because their focus, you know, the last decade really has been on protecting their states and their leaders, not, the focus hasn't been on, you know, on protecting citizens. So there has to be almost a, you know, a change in their thinking and also a change in their approach, you know, over the next few weeks, the next few months, if, you know, if individual governments and if the African Union, you know, want to deal effectively, you know, with the threats of local terrorism. And now just, you know, just in terms of African countries wanting, you know, a seat, you know, at the Security Council, remember there's been coming now, you know, this debate and has been coming for a very, very long time now, but the problem has been that African countries have been unable really, you know, to come together and decide on one country or, you know, to agree. I mean, Nigeria wants to have a seat, South Africa wanted to have a seat, you know, Egypt in the past wanted to have a seat. So, you know, this debate really about wanting to have a voice at the UN Security Council has actually been more dividing African countries. My sense really has been, I think, a better way for, you know, for African countries is to try to get the AU actually having one voice at the UN Security Council rather than try to get individual countries, you know, to get a seat there.
Ambassador, is it important for Africa to speak with one voice at the UN? I mean, as you've pointed out, sometimes Africa feels that it's been unfairly treated. You mentioned the example of the ICC. Leaders feel that we've been targeted here. We don't see Western leaders appear before the court.
I definitely think that, and I've said this many, many times in lectures that I've done, that, you know, we're on the wrong side of history if we don't allow a permanent seat for the region, I think, on the continent. It is the continent that is, despite all of the things we've talked about, it is an emerging market continent also from the business perspective as well. And that has to trickle down, of course, to the average African citizen. There is a challenge, though, in getting the African Union or the members of the African Union to support one country and really push that country for the seat. And they do have to do that. They're not going to be able to get it individually unless they have a collective voice as to whom, when, and why.
That's where we're going to have to leave it, I'm afraid. We've run out of time. William Gumede in Johannesburg, Ambassador Robin Sanders with me in Washington. Thanks to both of you for joining us. That is all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at cctv_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.